Barely weeks after Super Typhoon Uwan turned the Philippines into a nation of flooded towns and silent coastlines, satellite maps have begun to glow once more, this time with a new circular mass forming over the Pacific. At first, meteorologists thought it was a false echo, a trick of the radar. But as the image sharpened, the truth emerged. Another system, vast and spiraling, drawing breath from the same ocean that hasn't cooled since the last catastrophe. In the control rooms of Manila, forecasters exchange the same uneasy glance. Outside, the wind feels different, thicker, heavier, as if the air itself remembers. Survivors of Uwan look up at the sky and recognize that color, that silence before the storm. They know it's coming. In this video, we're going to look at how the Philippines, battered by back-to-back super typhoons, is now confronting something far more terrifying than bad weather. This is no longer about a single storm. It's about a pattern rewriting the country's destiny. We'll explore how Super Typhoon Uwan exposed a terrifying new climate phenomenon, where each storm fuels the next, leaving no time to recover, no moment to breathe. Stay till the end, because what's forming now could change everything the world knows about the Pacific and about survival itself. It began like any other typhoon season. Local meteorologists had warned of several tropical disturbances forming over the Pacific, and residents did what they always do: patched roofs, stocked food, charged flashlights, and waited for the sky to change. But this time, something was different. What looked like another ordinary storm cycle was the beginning of a terrifying new pattern, one that would redefine the word disaster. In early November 2025, Super Typhoon Uwan roared across the Pacific with winds strong enough to twist steel towers and waves powerful enough to erase coastlines. It struck the Philippines on November 9th, carrying sustained winds of 185 kilometers per hour and gusts reaching 230. Those numbers alone were frightening. Yet the true horror wasn't in the speed of the wind. It was in its timing. Uwan arrived barely a week after Typhoon Kalmiji had devastated the same nation, killing more than 200 people and leaving thousands without homes. By the time Uwan appeared on satellite maps, the country was still bleeding. The soil was already waterlogged from Kalmiji's rains. Power lines dangled like vines over flooded roads. Thousands of families were still huddled in gymnasiums, and classrooms turned into emergency shelters. Then, the next monster formed. When Uwan made landfall in Aurora province, its circular mass spread across nearly the entire archipelago, stretching more than 1,400 kilometers wide. From above, it looked less like a storm and more like a living organism swallowing islands one by one. Meteorologists watching the radar feed fell silent. This wasn't a single typhoon. It was a system large enough to warp weather patterns across Southeast Asia. But it wasn't the violent wind that broke the nation's spirit. It was the water that came with it. Along the eastern coast, the ocean began to rise, not in crashing waves, but as a slow, unstoppable surge. In places like Catanduanes and Samar, walls of seawater climbed 3 meters high, flooding villages that had never seen tides reach their streets. Experts later explained that these weren't simple storm surges. The ocean itself had been pushed inland, lifted by pressure differences and dragged forward by Uwan's rotation, turning farmland into temporary seas. Within 48 hours, close to 1 million Filipinos were forced to evacuate. Many fled with their clothes still damp from the last disaster. Entire towns were on the move again, families clutching bags of rice, old men carrying radios wrapped in plastic, children holding their pets. The same schools, churches, and sports halls that had sheltered victims of Typhoon Kalmiji were now filled beyond capacity. Imagine two disasters stacked on top of each other, one still unfolding while the next begins. And this is where the story's deeper truth unfolds. Scientists have been warning for years that the Philippines was entering a new era of compound climate events, disasters that overlap and intensify each other. Unlike in the past, when typhoons came one at a time and people could rebuild between them, the modern pattern leaves no recovery window. The storms are clustering, feeding off each other's leftovers. The geography of the country makes this unavoidable. The Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands, scattered like stepping stones across the world's warmest ocean. Warm water is fuel for typhoons, and the Pacific holds an endless supply. When storms form here, they don't just pass through, they grow, feeding on heat and moisture before slamming into land. The very features that make the islands beautiful, the mountains, the narrow straits, the coralline bays, also make them deadly. Mountains block the wind, but trap the rain. Narrow gulfs amplify the surge. Rivers overflow into valleys where millions of people live. Meteorologists call storm surge the silent killer. It doesn't roar like a tsunami or flash like lightning. It creeps. The sea begins to bulge. The wind piles water against the coast, and before anyone realizes it, entire neighborhoods vanish beneath the surface. Water doesn't simply come and go. It lingers, turning cities into lagoons for days. The world saw the brutality of storm surge back in 2013 when Super Typhoon Haiyan, known locally as Yolanda, struck the central Philippines. That surge reached 6 meters, higher than a 2-story house, and killed more than 6,000 people. Survivors said it was like the sea had come alive. One woman, Maria Santos, remembered the sound. It was like a train coming from the ocean. The water rose from the ground and fell from the sky at the same time. Her home sat 3 kilometers from shore, yet seawater flooded her living room within minutes. Haiyan taught a painful lesson. It's not the wind that kills the most. It's the sea reclaiming the land. 12 years later, Uwan resurrected that nightmare. Its slow pace of 25 kilometers per hour gave it time to gather immense power. Yet it moved too quickly for millions to evacuate safely. Even provinces officially outside its predicted path, Palawan, Visayas, Mindanao, suffered fierce winds and catastrophic flooding. And this time, something truly strange happened. Meteorologists tracking Uwan in real time noticed that the storm was breaking the rules. Normally, once a typhoon crosses land, it weakens as mountains disrupt its structure. But Uwan's eye wall stayed intact for hours, churning deep inland and continuing to generate mini surges along rivers. Some experts suggested that warm inland lakes and saturated soil were helping it stay alive longer than usual. Others suspected climate feedback loops, where heat trapped by greenhouse gases gave the storm extra fuel even after landfall. As the storm raged, communication networks collapsed. Bridges were swept away. Power grids failed. In northern Luzon, evacuation convoys stalled when rising rivers overtopped the bridges ahead of them. In Metro Manila, flood warnings reached districts that rarely face the sea, places like Sucat and Parañaque. Residents there watched water creep up staircases and into garages. Hospitals in Baikal lost power, forcing doctors to move patients by hand to upper floors. One hospital director later said that his staff performed emergency surgeries using flashlights while water gushed through the hallways. What made it all worse was the sense of déjà vu. Just a week earlier, those same medical teams had been treating injuries from Typhoon Kalmiji. Now, they were reliving it, only with fewer supplies and less strength. Relief agencies found themselves trapped in a logistical nightmare. Over 900,000 people were already in shelters when Uwan hit, and aid warehouses had barely been restocked from the previous storm. The Philippine Army had to recall units that were still conducting recovery operations elsewhere. The World Food Program and the Red Cross scrambled to redirect food, water, and medicine, but roads were gone, airports flooded, and fuel scarce. Some rescue teams used inflatable boats to deliver aid between rooftops. Others built makeshift runways on dry patches of highway, so helicopters could land. By the time Uwan's winds finally eased, the devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire coastlines had shifted. Satellite images showed new lagoons where rice fields once stood. Fishing boats were found kilometers inland. But perhaps the most haunting discovery wasn't physical. It was systemic. The nation's disaster response framework, designed for one emergency at a time, was collapsing under the weight of repetition. Its institutions were still calibrated for a 20th century climate, a world where storms were seasonal, predictable, and isolated. Today, that assumption no longer holds. Relief goods meant for one event now have to be rationed across multiple crises. Evacuation centers meant for short stays are becoming semi-permanent settlements. Children are growing up in shelters that were supposed to close years ago. Scientists studying the region's climate trends paint a grim picture. Over the last decade, Pacific Ocean temperatures have risen steadily, staying warm longer into the year. That heat doesn't dissipate when one storm passes. It lingers, priming the ocean for the next. The result is a conveyor belt of storms, each one feeding off the residue of the last. This new phenomenon has earned a chilling name among climate researchers: cascading disasters. Each storm leaves behind conditions that make the next one stronger: warmer seas, weakened infrastructure, displaced populations, and exhausted responders. It's a feedback loop, and the Philippines sits at its center. Already in 2025, the country had recorded 21 named storms, more than its yearly average before the year was even over. The 22nd was already forming east of the Pacific, as if nature itself had stopped taking breaks. The rhythm of recovery was gone. The country was living in permanent response mode. For the first time, meteorologists began describing typhoons not as individual systems, but as clusters. They explained that when one passes, it leaves behind a trail of moist, unstable air that acts like a magnet for the next disturbance. In this way, storms are no longer random. They're sequential, connected, almost cooperative. Each disaster lays the groundwork for the next. And as Uwan faded into the South China Sea, the sense of relief across the islands was fragile. Everyone knew that another storm could already be brewing beyond the horizon. The air itself felt heavy, as if refusing to rest. When the clouds finally cleared, the full scale of the disaster emerged. From the air, whole provinces looked like they'd been erased. In parts of Aurora and Quezon, floodwaters stretched as far as the eye could see, shimmering like an inland sea. The roofs of houses were barely visible above the surface. Power poles leaned at impossible angles, and the outlines of highways disappeared beneath brown, restless water. On the ground, survivors waded through chest-deep currents, dragging plastic containers, mattresses, and sacks of rice, whatever could still float. The government declared a nationwide state of calamity, but even that couldn't capture the chaos. Relief trucks lined up for kilometers on flooded roads. Helicopters hovered over isolated villages, dropping boxes of food that splashed into muddy fields. The nation's Coast Guard found boats stranded inland, their hulls wedged between collapsed houses. For many communities, rescue didn't come for days, not because of negligence, but because there was simply nowhere left to land or dock. Disaster response officials later described the crisis as a domino collapse. Every system that depended on another, power, transport, water, communications, failed one after the other. In the province of Samar, a telecommunications tower toppled during Kalmiji and hadn't yet been repaired when Uwan arrived. As a result, when the new storm hit, emergency broadcasts went silent. Residents never received the updated evacuation warnings. Entire barangays vanished from contact for nearly a week. In Manila, the capital became a logistical command center and a refugee city at the same time. The Philippine Air Force turned sections of Villamor Air Base into temporary shelters. Families camped under the wings of parked aircraft, using tarps and blankets to create small enclosures. The government had planned for typhoons, but not for two Category 5 storms within the same 10 days. The nation's supply of emergency tents and blankets had already run out before Uwan made landfall. The psychological impact was devastating. For millions of Filipinos, disaster had become routine. Children born after Haiyan had never lived through a decade without a super typhoon. Psychologists working with aid groups began to document a new phenomenon they called climate fatigue, a deep exhaustion not just from physical loss, but from an emotional cycle of fleeing, surviving, rebuilding, and losing everything again. In one interview, a fisherman from Leyte, put it simply, we don't fear the storm anymore. We fear what happens after, the waiting, the hunger, the silence. That silence is what scientists and policymakers now find hardest to confront. Because behind the emotional stories lies a brutal scientific truth. The Pacific Ocean itself is changing faster than human systems can adapt. In previous decades, typhoon seasons had a rhythm. Storms would form, dissipate, and the ocean would cool. Now, ocean heat content stays high all year. That heat becomes stored energy, waiting for the next atmospheric trigger. Meteorological agencies across Asia have confirmed that the Philippine Sea is now one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. Temperatures that once averaged 28 degrees Celsius now often exceed 30 degrees Celsius. That may sound small, but for tropical storms, every fraction of a degree adds explosive power. With more energy in the system, storms intensify faster and lose strength more slowly. Super Typhoon Uwan's strange persistence over land was not an anomaly, it was a warning. New data from Japan's meteorological satellites showed that the storm drew moisture from distant weather systems, almost like a living organism extending its reach. Some scientists compared it to a climate engine, feeding off the excess heat trapped by global warming. And while nature was rewriting the rules, human infrastructure remained stuck in the past. The Philippines has one of the most advanced disaster preparedness systems in Southeast Asia, but even that wasn't enough. The country's National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, NDRRMC, was designed for singular events, a typhoon, an earthquake, a flood. But the new pattern demands a completely different mindset. As one official admitted, we're used to responding to a disaster. We're not trained to respond to a series of them without rest. That gap between preparation and reality is now the biggest threat. Supplies meant for 50,000 evacuees must now serve double or triple that number. Infrastructure built to survive one storm rarely holds after three. Farmers who lose one harvest can recover. Those who lose two in the same month face permanent ruin. And as relief efforts multiply, international aid stretches thin. Donor fatigue sets in. The world's attention shifts elsewhere, even as local suffering grows deeper. Economists warn that this new cycle of disasters is quietly eroding the nation's development gains. Agriculture, which employs a third of the workforce, suffers repeated destruction of crops and irrigation systems. Rice and coconut farms in Baikal and eastern Visayas, the country's food basket, have been flooded 5 times in 2 years. Insurance payouts can't keep up. In some villages, families have stopped replanting altogether, knowing the next storm will arrive before harvest. Tourism, too, takes a hit. White sand beaches once filled with visitors now sit empty. Their resorts turned into evacuation sites. Roads leading to famous destinations are cracked or underwater. And yet, amid the despair, there are glimpses of extraordinary resilience. In northern Samar, villagers used debris from fallen trees to build rafts that ferried the elderly across flooded areas. In Quezon, teachers turned classrooms into communal kitchens, feeding hundreds with whatever supplies remained. Radio operators, using battery-powered transmitters, kept communication alive between isolated islands. This spirit of adaptation, born from necessity, has become the country's most valuable survival tool. But experts say resilience alone won't be enough anymore. The Philippines, they argue, must move from reaction to reconfiguration. That means designing cities, farms, and energy systems around the expectation of constant disaster. Homes raised on stilts, power grids capable of restarting autonomously, crops engineered to withstand saltwater, evacuation centers built as permanent structures, not temporary tents. Some pilot projects are already underway. In Leyte, engineers are testing amphibious houses, homes that float when floods rise and settle when waters recede. In Mindoro, scientists are mapping high elevation zones that could serve as future settlement areas. And in Manila Bay, A massive coastal defense project aims to protect millions of residents from storm surges by 2030. Still, these solutions come with a price. The government estimates that adapting to a multi-hazard climate will cost billions annually, money that many developing nations don't have. International aid can help, but experts argue that long-term resilience must come from domestic policy and education, teaching communities not just how to evacuate, but how to live with the sea. In the wake of Typhoon Uwan, climate scientists gathered in Quezon City for an emergency summit. Their conclusion was sobering. The era of discrete typhoons is over. The country must prepare for clusters, chains of storms that strike in rapid succession, turning recovery into an ongoing process. One researcher described it as living inside a revolving door of disasters. What makes this especially alarming is that the same conditions developing over the Philippines are appearing elsewhere across the Pacific. Vietnam, Taiwan, and Japan have all reported back-to-back typhoons within shorter intervals. Global warming isn't just intensifying individual storms, it's synchronizing them, compressing their timelines, and reducing the planet's breathing space. For Filipinos, the challenge is existential. A country cannot rebuild if rebuilding never ends. If every bridge, school, and hospital destroyed today is hit again next month, progress becomes a memory instead of a goal. Economists predict that by 2030, recurring climate disasters could cost the Philippines up to 7% of its GDP annually, an economic wound that never heals. And yet, despite the despair, the story of the Philippines remains one of courage. In every flooded barangay, there are people who refuse to give up. The mother who cooks for her neighbors on a makeshift stove, the fisherman who repairs his boat even as rain pours, the teacher who returns to class surrounded by mud and broken glass. Their endurance is proof that resilience, though stretched thin, still exists. But this resilience should not be mistaken for invincibility. The message of Super Typhoon Uwan is clear. Nature's pace has outgrown human preparedness. The planet is warming faster than our systems can evolve. The storms of the future will not wait for recovery. They will arrive one after another, like a chain reaction with no reset button. By December 2025, satellite imagery showed another weather system forming east of Mindanao. Meteorologists hadn't yet named it, but its shape was unmistakable. The atmosphere above the Pacific pulsed with energy, shimmering like a warning. For many Filipinos still living in evacuation centers, the fear was silent but universal. What if the next storm is already coming? That question lingers long after the rain stops. It's not just about weather anymore. It's about survival in a new climate reality. The Philippines, sitting on the front line of the Pacific typhoon belt, cannot change its geography, but it can change its strategy. The path forward will require science, policy, and courage in equal measure. It will mean building not just stronger walls, but smarter systems. And it will demand something even greater: the will to accept that this is the new normal and still find a way to live through it. Because in the end, as rescue teams pull bodies from the flood and rebuild bridges for the fifth time, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The danger isn't the next typhoon. It's the shrinking space between them, the vanishing pause that once allowed people to recover, mourn, and hope again. And as dawn breaks over the battered islands, the nation looks eastward toward the restless ocean. Out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, the clouds are already gathering.